goes into the...
Oh my god! He literally... Okay, he went there.
Analysis.
Does anyone ever need this much space? This is insane. This is crazy. But let's pause this music here. I want to jump into this one. Let's hang out.
Let's compare the world's smallest houses with the world's largest. Just how small and how big do houses get? What are the most important design and living considerations that go along with each of these scales, as well as the ones that are in between? And finally, how much space do we actually need in order to live comfortably? By the time we get to about 100 square feet or 9 square meters, we get something that's about the size of a room that I'm used to, or a very tiny house. For some, this might be the threshold for permanent residence, but it's going to present a number of challenges as well as benefits. Spaces for living at this scale are probably changing over the course of the day as the occupant is making it suitable for pending activities like cooking, working, or sleeping. You're probably not entertaining too much in spaces like this either, or having guests over. There's certainly no room for a game of ping pong. So residents in the 100 square foot range rely heavily on local amenities and activities to provide social and collective experiences.
Is that a bad thing?
David Thoreau's Carmel Place in New York, for instance, is the city's first micro-unit tower. The small size and the shape of the units allows them to be constructed off-site in a factory, put on a truck, and lifted into place with a crane. This saves on construction costs and time. While these units are still tightly designed for functional purposes, they will hold normal furniture like a sofa or chairs, just not really everything at the same time.
I wanna look at these floor plans for a sec, 1 minute. Modular construction is actually some of the best construction for the environment. Given that it's in a controlled climate, there's a lot less room for error and mistakes. The construction tends to be of better quality too, because again, it's in a controlled environment. You're not exposed to factors like the weather. Given that you are within an indoor space when you're constructing it too, you are working on like a flat pad, which tends to make like things like how things are fastened or like the air tightness of the envelope and stuff is more reliable when it's constructed modularly for that reason. So that's really cool. It is kind of funny, this paradox that I'm seeing too between this surge in the tiny house movement, and also I'm seeing in contrast to that sort of a rejection for small apartments. I see this especially where I live, kind of in Western Canada, where we'll build new apartment buildings with units that are incredibly small. And there's a lot of complaining, a lot of critique on the impracticalities of having such a small space, especially when at the same time, we are hearing this rhetoric from, I guess, municipal bodies and stuff like that we should be living in higher densities and we should be lessening our carbon footprint by living closer to where we work and stuff like that, which requires more urbanism. But then in contrast, we're not building apartment units that will support families, for example. It tends to cater to more of the single or coupled white collar worker, but it also tends to be these small apartments, and maybe this is where the critique comes. They come at a quality that is typically for the upper middle class, or intended for the upper middle class. So the finishes are pretty ornate, the fixtures are more high end. So I guess maybe now that I'm wondering out loud, this contrast that I'm seeing between gravitation towards the tiny house movement, the tiny house movement has become what it has as a rejection to affordable housing for, like, I guess, millennials. I don't know how much Gen Z we're seeing is adopting tiny houses quite yet. Looking, I guess, at modular apartments like this, like I think small spaces like this are very clever, and they do get you more out in your community and in your environment, hopefully. It's a little bit different maybe in Canada, where we have winter for 8 months of the year, and maybe that's where some of the semblances of claustrophobia come in, whereas tiny houses are more generally in rural areas, more out in nature, typically as you see them. Whereas modular apartments like this, not only are you confined in a small space, but you're confined in a small space very close to everybody else that is also confined in a close space. I'm just taking a minute to look at these layouts quick too. I'm curious for how they have these designed. And because what I often see in small spaces that are built in the city, they will build them small but leave out integral elements in order to save space, such as closets for your bedroom, storage at the front door for your shoes and your outdoor wear, things like that. They will forego those things, kind of putting it on the homeowner to be like, okay, well, here is what we have for you, but if you want to have clothing storage, you can buy a wardrobe or more for yourself and then try and fit it in this small space. And I'm even kind of seeing a little bit of that in these plans that I'm looking at here. I do see some closet storage, one closet storage, but if we're looking at these layouts, there isn't really a lot of space for, but I guess he did show the interior renders. It looks like we have some built-in millwork storage. So maybe that does offset, and if it's built in and kind of integrated in the space, great, way better. If they're putting the onus on the purchaser or the dweller of the apartment to source furniture to accommodate for their storage needs, not good. Not good. So
Sofa or chairs, just not really everything at the same time. And at this size, you're close to the threshold of using the space to address some of the psychological needs of dwelling that go beyond merely the functional daily requirements. For instance, we tend to feel happier and healthier when we can bring others into our space to telegraph who we are and what's important to us. Living and Tree Hugger founder Graham Hill, he lives in a 300 square foot space, and he claims that his apartment will sleep 4 people comfortably and that he commonly has dinner parties for 12. He says, my space is well built, affordable, and as functional as living spaces twice the size.
but does he live alone? Because if it's just him and then he has people over sometimes, that's very different.
On their website with this very setup of 12 people having a dinner party.
I'm curious, I guess, if there's any commentary on the internet somewhere of the contrast between tiny houses that are standalone houses and small spaces that are high density urbanized spaces. I'd be curious to know if there's any like sociological perspectives on why one might feel better than the other. For example, maybe it's the proximity to a bunch of people, like tiny houses are typically more in nature. Maybe it's also the type of person that is generally like gravitating to one or the other of those lifestyles, whereas like maybe a tiny house owner or pursuer would be more partial to enjoying living rurally and alternative ways of living, whereas someone who is living in the city and isn't really as aware of alternative ways of living may feel as though they are being forced into small living spaces, which is what I hear the rhetoric in the location that I live to. It's like, oh, if you're going to live in the inner city, if you're going to live in the urban parts, you're going to be confined to a small space, whereas why would you do that when you can go move to the suburbs and you get so much more space? Is it the size of the space though, or is it the proximity to people? I think if there's well-designed neighborhoods, which we see in Europe, it makes it a lot more desirable. There's so many questions.
Now we're at the size of an average dwelling in a number of different countries, like in Italy, Sweden, Japan, France.
Oh, he's going there. He's going there.
All right around that range. A space this size is usually pretty adequate for a couple. It might be a 1 or 2 bedroom layout. It's also about the size of the model of the post-war suburban home in the US from Levittown called the Jubilee. It costs
Okay, he might actually get into this before I even have to say it, but yes, the average square footage of the single family home in the mid-century, I'd say around the 50s, 60s era, I believe, was 900 square feet. And the average square foot of the detached home in North America today is, I believe, 2,500 to 2,800 square feet. So we have more than doubled the amount. And keep in mind, too, that back in the mid-century, the 900 square foot house size was typical or conventional for, I guess, like the nuclear family and designed for a family of 4. Which is interesting, too, because we see the housing sizes have increased, but we've also seen a decline in birth rates, too, right? I don't necessarily know if the nuclear family is so typical anymore, but the sizing of housing has like ballooned. It's crazy.
$11,600 in 1956 and targeted veterans with growing families. It was only slightly smaller than the average home in the United States at the time, as a typical house of this era would hold 3.37 people on average. This size is so commonplace that it seems like a little bit of a sweet spot for urban environments. There are compromises, it certainly can't accommodate everything, but the necessities are there, and it's flexible enough to be configured in ways that it would suit a large majority of the population. But houses across the United States have grown since the days of the
Oh, he's gonna go there.
all the way to about 2,200 square feet or 206 square meters on average. This is despite the fact that
Actually, that's larger, or that's smaller than I had learned in school.
compared to the 3.4 of 60 years ago. There are a number of reasons that go into this supersizing of the space and simultaneously thinning out of the inhabitants. These range all the way from zoning laws to the availability of mass-produced building materials. Earning the right to more space just seems very American, a country built on colonizing the frontier. But also thinking about homes as financial investments, which leads people to buy more than they need, with the thought that it will yield a greater return on investment goes into this as well.
This is such a big thing. This is actually, okay, so this investment factor, I think there's this common misconception I see that like the larger your house, the safer the investment. Interestingly enough, that is why we opted for the smaller house that we have though in the inner city where we live, because when there is an economic downturn, suburban homes, especially those on the outskirts of urban areas, are the first to lose their value the quickest, and they are the slowest to regain their value. So if from a investment perspective, it is actually quite a bit safer to, if you can afford it, invest more into the inner city urban areas, even if you're less, like our house is quite small. Our house is like 950 square feet and there's 5 people that live here. We could have opted to get a 2,000 square foot house or more even, maybe, for the same price range that we could afford. I think where this might not count though, like this is specifically more for detached housing. I don't necessarily know if this applies to condos, at least in Western Canada where I've seen it. I think the condo market seems to be a little bit overinflated right now just because we keep building them. But it's, yeah, I wonder, he might get into that too, I'm curious.
The flip side, though, there are all sorts of negative effects of living larger, including pollution from cars, which inevitably transport people between these large buildings, sprawl, which leads to more impervious paving, etc. As we move up, one interesting design consideration is that most house styles got their start when houses were around 1,000 or 2,000 square feet. So, say the elements of the Craftsman bungalow are sized to fit.
I love this style.
The porch, the gable roof, the windows can all fit comfortably and seem to be in relatively pleasing proportions when attached to a small 3-bedroom home. But as things get bigger, say around 5,000 to 10,000 square feet, we start to get into the mansion territory. This is where a new set of frictions develop.
Oh my god, I should pull this up after. We should go through this subreddit. I found this subreddit. It's called McMansion Hell, and it literally just like rips apart these giant mega homes that he's probably going to talk about here. It's hilarious.
Because a building this size is clearly larger than functionally necessary.
Also, I'm going to preface this by stating too that I am incredibly opposed to housing of this size. I think it's wasteful. I think that it is just more of an ego flex than anything else. I don't think that the average person needs more than maybe 2,500 square feet. Obviously, that conversation changes if you have a lot of children or a big family that's sharing the space with you. However, if there's any discussion about large housing on this channel, I am generally very opposed to it and probably going to be very harsh.
Unless filled with extended family or other functional necessities. This is how you get McMansions, a term that was coined in the 1980s for the kinds of homes that were springing up across America where their showmanship outweighed their craftsmanship.
Yeah.
There's an amazing resource called
There's so many of
McMansion
these.
Hill, run by critic Kate Wagner.
Oh my god, he literally, okay, he went there.
Analysis of why McMansions are bad architecture. It includes a lack of clarity and hierarchy in their designs, and she breaks down all the failures of houses that are built like this.
Yo, we should go over this on stream one day.
Moving up in size yet again, now we're getting huge at 50.
I need to note too, and this is more of a, I guess, like a comment for anybody that is ever looking for a new place to rent or a new place to live. Oftentimes, a lot of these larger scale rooms that we've seen adopted in McMansions, like the foyer or even maybe the powder room at one point was technically within this umbrella. House builders will distract you from the functionality of a space by applying those more like luxurious amenities at a smaller scale to make it feel more high-end than it actually is. We'll see this with things like angled staircases, 45-degree angled walls, or like giant soaker tubs in the suites in your bathroom. And it's in practical application, it's actually generally really dysfunctional and kind of annoying especially when you get into smaller spaces where they're trying to cram these, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess like high-end or luxury aspects of these larger builds into more of like the 2,500 to 2,000 square foot like show home. So that's
50,000 to
one annoying thing to account for.
Square meters. Now houses of this size are starting to look like and behave like more bigger buildings like hotels, schools, or malls.
Does anyone ever need this much space? This is insane. This is crazy. We get a lot of these, though, in Canada just because we have such an expansive land mass, too.
It's the largest house in the world at an insane 400,000 square feet or 37,000 square meters. It's called Antilia, and it rises 27 floors above Mumbai.
That's like apartment size. Like that's like the size of an actual apartment.
It has 9 elevators, 168 parking spots, 50-person movie theater, and has also.
I've had office projects
it's a multi-use
smaller than this.
This house is basically a small vertical town with a total of 600 full-time staff. Belay argues that dissatisfaction then is a result of comparison, not objective qualities in the size.
So
in the Wall Street Journal,
that would explain, I guess, the phenomenon that I mentioned earlier of people in Western Canada where we live pointing to the suburbs and being like, oh, but look at how much they get there.
If you're interested in learning more about home sizes and their histories, I highly recommend The History of Home narrated by Nick Offerman, found on CuriosityStream. In the final episode of the series, they focus on private life by exploring the history of 3 rooms, the study, the bedroom, and the bathroom. And my next video will be specifically on toilets and bathrooms. If you use the link down in the description...
We should watch those! That'll be really interesting, and seeing where the sizes go with that. Yeah, it's kind of funny, and I think it's most evident in the contrast between the sizes of residences that you see in North America versus everywhere else in the world. But again, North America is a lot more susceptible to urban sprawl and requiring a car to get places. I think that we are lacking in good infrastructure for transit and walkable amenities. I see this there's this concept, oh my God, it was the target of kind of a conspiracy theory back a few months ago when the World Economic Forum met and talked about 15-minute cities and the establishment of more 15-minute cities around the world. It kind of spun off into this crazy conspiracy theory about forced districts and segregation and stuff like that. However, at its core, I did learn about this in school back in the early 2010s. Generally, at its core, a 15-minute city is just a city/urban environment where all of your amenities, your work, your education, your healthcare, your shopping, everything is within a 15-minute walk of where you live. And so it's better not just for, I guess, like from a time perspective, because everything's close, but it's actually psychologically, it's better too, because the more people that we have in walkable neighborhoods out on the street, the more semblance of community you feel, the more likely you are to know your neighbors and interact with them. It didn't really get into the design of the suburbs either in North America. I'd like to see if we have a good photo of it. But in contrast to back when this style of home was more prominent, this was during an era where we used to interact more with the street, I guess. So back in this time, children would typically play outside more in the front of the house, and it was more like a social occurrence to have the front porch and hang out there. That that brought forth this phenomenon known as eyes on the street. Oh no, I forget the sociologist or the urbanist that coined the term. It was a woman though, but it moved away from this in the 50s or 60s with the prominence of the car in favor of, can I find where he has the screenshot of our suburbs here, more in favor of, I guess, more in favor of the garage on the front of the house, and then the porch and the outdoor social areas moved into the backyard of the house. So instead of being out front and interacting, like your kids could interact with their neighbors more readily, you were more likely to run into people and talk with them. It kind of moved us more into this kind of segregated isolation. So given the lack of walkability within suburbs and the necessity for a car, and how the social outdoor spaces have kind of been confined within the lot that your house is on and kind of tucked away behind the lot, suburbs are generally more isolating, and even though you have more space, they tend to feel less, I guess, communal or neighborly, so to speak. So I have a lot of criticisms about suburbs in general, but I bet you there's a whole video that we could find that gets into that whole phenomenon.